Welcome back to the Scaling Tech Podcast, the podcast for leaders of growing software engineering teams. I'm your host, Arin. And today I'm trying out a new format. If you've listened to past episodes of the Scaling Tech Podcast, then the biggest change is that going forward, I'll be the only host of the Scaling Tech Podcast. My friend, colleague, and business partner, David Alfaro, is moving his focus to other parts of the business, so I'll take on all the hosting duties going forward. I'm really grateful for David's contributions to the Scaling Tech Podcast to date and all the other adventures he and I have shared together over the last decade plus. So thank you, David. I'm also going to make a few other smaller changes to the podcast going forward. We'll try to keep the episodes a little more bite-sized, more in the 30 to 45-minute time frame instead of hour long. I think that's a good time frame to help make sure that my guests and I are delivering value to you in more discrete chunks, which is very agile, right? So we're going to also start posting more snippets from each episode so that you can consume those delicious bite-sized chunks of value in whatever platform you choose. So please make sure to hit the like or subscribe button on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this episode, as well as on our YouTube and LinkedIn pages. We'll also continue to post show notes and links on scalingtechpod.com for each episode. So you can go there to join our email list, as well as to suggest topics and guests. So thank you to everyone who's been a listener of this podcast to date. I hope you'll continue to join me on this next phase of our journey together, where we continue to learn about the technologies and management skills that every engineering manager needs to know. All right, let's get on to today's interview with David Asch about the Agile enterprise.
Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, where we help you manage your growing engineering team. Through expert interviews, we help you navigate the challenges of leading, hiring, growing, and nurturing your tech team to deliver the value your customers demand. Brought to you by agilityfeet.com, experts in staffing engineering teams in Latin America for clients globally.
David Asch produced robust enterprise software as a service, cloud-based products in all his managerial positions throughout a 36-year career. He introduced Agile philosophy and methodologies to each of his companies, enabling his teams to meet their goals. Asch currently owns and operates 10xPrinciples, a management organizational consulting company that helps technology companies navigate the transition from startup to mid-stage. During this time of rapid growth and change, teams typically find that the wearing many hats behavior from their startup days is no longer the best approach to honoring commitments. Asch helps these companies weave Agile practices into the fabric of their cultures, and he's also author of The Agile Enterprise from Business Expert Press. Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, David.
Thank you, Arin. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's great to see you again. So let's start with a really important question here, I think, and related to your book. Why is Agile still relevant in the enterprise? Isn't everyone Agile now?
I think you're coming in with fighting words, Arin. Everyone says they're Agile, and who doesn't want to be Agile? Right. Agile is a great word, and whatever marketing team kind of brought that into the fore was brilliant.
Right.
And so, yeah, everybody says they're Agile. Everybody wants to be Agile, but I think in practice, really very few are. And Agile was designed for engineering teams primarily, and many of them are Agile-ish, and nobody sort of follows a methodology to the T or to the letter, and nor should they.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, Agile has not really the concept of Agile is applicable widely. And I think very few companies are truly Agile.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, it's fighting words, I suppose, right? It kind of makes me think back to, over my career working with Agile methods, which is around 20 years now, thinking that, someday Agile should be so normal in the way that we work that we don't even use the word anymore. It's just how software is built. It's just how we do work, right? And kind of like, I think it's analogous a little bit to the way that the term AI is overused and everything right now. And then also gets misused. And when things go wrong, things get blamed as, inappropriately blamed. Well, we tried Agile, but it didn't work for us for, whatever reason. And that's Agile's fault, not the fact that we weren't actually doing anything about Agile to begin with, right? So I think, and in a way, maybe even that is a sign of maturity, that it is getting inappropriately blamed at times.
It is for sure. And I think part of I blame the methodologies in a lot of ways. I think the Agile Manifesto is a pretty pure thing, and it's an argument about collaboration and about sort of taking small bites and about this idea of delivering something of value over kind of extensive planning. It all makes intuitive sense to just about everybody who hears it. And the thing about a philosophy is just that philosophies don't come with rule books, and they're kind of vague by design, and so that's where the methodology sort of industry has kind of come to the fore. We'll give you something that will show you how to operationalize Agile, and that so people know sprints and they know retrospectives and they know story points and they know pair programming and they know Kanban and they learn all these things, and sometimes interestingly the whole methodology kind of refutes one of the tenets of Agile, that it's really communication over process. Not the process isn't important, but kind of interpersonal communication comes first. And a lot of groups get wrapped up in kind of the the mechanics of how do we make Agile work, and how does a sprint run, and what do we do with our backlog, and all those things that kind of abstract away from the core principles of the idea.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I've always thought of the Agile Manifesto as a really good set of guardrails, and kind of what is a bit of the genius, but maybe also you could argue like a weak spot in the sense of it doesn't tell you exactly what to do. It doesn't say that this is the method above all others by design, but it gives you these really great set of guardrails that you should work within,
Yeah,
right?
indeed.
And when you talk about like and it like collaboration over contract negotiation and completing software over documentation, those sorts of things. It's always, well, it's not that contracts aren't necessary. They're
That's
very
right.
necessary, unfortunately, right? But we should be more focused on how do we create a relationship between supplier and company, between remote development teams, that's based on collaboration rather than going back to change documents and old requirements documents and stuff like that.
Right.
And so, yeah, you can do a lot of things and call it Agile, and that's the pro and the con of using a term like Agile. Um, but I always say to people, like, you can do anything you want. I don't care if you call it Scrum or Kanban or Scrumban or whatever. But whenever you make a change, go back to that manifesto and think about those principles. Are you operating within those guardrails? And if you're not, that's where you need to question, are you really doing, Agile? And why are you making this change if it doesn't sort of fit within those guardrails?
Right. I agree with that. And I think one of the key points you make is that in the manifesto it's communication over process, or just customer involvement over a contract. It's not that one precludes the other, it's just that
Right.
you favor one over the other. And
Exactly.
I think that gets lost a lot of times when a lot of people who kind of denigrate Agile say, oh well, Agile is so loosey goosey, you don't have to do any planning, you don't have to do anything. And in reality, software is hard to build no matter what. And
Yeah.
it's not like you can build it without planning and without forethought and without all of these things. And in a lot of ways, groups need to kind of understand that. And even if a methodology they're using doesn't necessarily allow for a long period of discovery, that has to be built in somehow.
Right.
And
Right.
whether or not it fits in a sprint or not, or whether you have a retrospective after it, that's kind of beside the point.
Yeah, I think they're good guidelines to follow. Again, it's kind of like, well, why, you say like, whether or not it fits within the sprint. Okay, well, if we're saying, okay, our user stories don't fit within the sprint, and that's okay, but we're still Agile. I think those sorts of, anytime you want to change the rules, essentially, if you're following like in that, we would be talking about a Scrum team, presumably. Is like, well, why are you changing? Why are you saying it's okay for a story to be bigger than the sprint? What's What's the motivation beyond that? And
Right.
it is, and that's where it goes back to like the Agile manifesto, right? Are we just saying that because, well, our contract said we had to work on this thing and we don't want to break it down further, or our original, Gantt chart plan said we were going to do this thing now. And so we have to just put it in the sprint and let's not bother breaking it into small pieces, right? That's not agile, right? You're favoring contract negotiation and following a plan over responding to change and, working in small deliverable chunks, right? Now, on the other hand, if it's, you know, there's some other reason, maybe some other unique technical reason, it's an exception to the rule, then, fine, I suppose, right? But like you always have to gut check
That's
yourself,
right.
I think is key.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And one thing to keep in mind is that the guys who sort of penned the Agile Manifesto were really just kind of codifying their their style of work that they were probably already doing. These guys were pros, and so they said, well, what's a better way than kind of this waterfallish thing that was sort of based on manufacturing or based on construction projects.
Absolutely. So, yeah, no, unfortunately, neither one of us were there at the crafting of the Agile Manifesto. So we all have a kind of our own story of how we came into this and how it interested us. What initially made you interested in Agile methods? And in particular, I'd love to hear too about applying those methods outside of only software development teams.
Sure, sure. So, I mean, my history is primarily as an engineering manager and somebody who's really kind of been on the hook to deliver software that solved customers' problems. And I learned about Agile pretty early in my career just because things happened to dovetail that way. And what I found was that really delivering small chunks of functionality actually worked. It wasn't always easy to do, and it's not easy. It's hard to do that. And really, and more so to deliver something that actually is of value to users and listening to them and understanding what it is. So I kind of had a long career doing Agile and introducing it at various places, and I found that there are really interesting ways to deal with it. Like in one circumstance, I worked at a company where I had a team that was in India and a large team, and uh, we weren't really being very effective uh, communicating back and forth, and they didn't. What I discovered is they didn't really have enough autonomy in part because they weren't trusted to have enough autonomy, and so they needed to have a way of kind of owning their own piece of things, at the same time providing enough transparency so that the other side in the United States could kind of figure out how things were going to fit together. So it was really an interesting uh, education for me in how teaching another team about this would really be valuable. Um, and so what I found is that when I started my consulting company, the reason I started it was just because what I've recognized is kind of a pathology, a corporate pathology, is that as companies grow and as they hit certain inflection points, there are stresses that come in that kind of change how companies need to work. And so, for example, moving from a startup to a mid-stage company involves more hiring and more this and more that. And often a lot of the cohesion that existed in a startup to keep things together and keep everybody kind of pushing in the same direction kind of gets lost in some ways, and important things get tossed on the floor sometimes. And so I found that focusing on some of those areas of stress was valuable, and in many of the consulting companies or many of the customers that I've dealt with in my consulting uh, have enabled me to kind of try out agile ideas across the company. I found that it has really worked interestingly and well, and people have intuitively flocked to it. And I don't use any of the agile buzzwords when I'm dealing with them. It's really just a matter of, well, how do we break this big thing For example, I was working with an HR team who came into money and needed to hire a bunch of people. And it started out, well, we just need to hire a bunch of people. So at the end of 6 months, we'll have all of our people in place and we'll just work, night and day until we make that happen. And, the problem with an approach like that is, well, all right, you can kill yourself working to do it, but it needs to be chunked a little bit better and it needs to be kind of thought through a little bit more carefully. And there are aspects of this that the HR team wasn't really thinking about, like how are you going to track candidates and how are you going to communicate properly with them? How are you even going to vet them? And so things like that. And how do we measure our progress along the way of hiring? And so it's not that you come out in the end any different necessarily. You still need to hire the same people in the end. But the question is if you can chunk it and kind of assess how you're doing at each point along the way, you kind of know how much trouble you're in or how well you're doing as you go. And one of the really interesting things that I discovered along the way is that as a team was assembled to hire, and it involved people from different departments who were hiring managers. Um, they started taking ownership of this process and saying, "Well, hey, the problem we're having here is that we've made bad hires in the past, and the reason we've made bad hires is we had this interview process where we do a lot of talking with candidates and." Then they didn't pan out in the end when we hired them. And they said, the problem is that we're hiring the best actors. And I was thinking, well, yeah, if if Meryl Streep were to interview for a coding position, she's a pretty polished and classically trained actress. She would learn what it would take to win a job in a computing company, and as a programmer. But she'd probably write spaghetti code when you got her in place. So you really want to try out somebody. And I've gone through the process of giving kind of take home exams to people, and where they are asked to do a chunk of work for you and then deliver it. And that's a difficult thing. And what I found that was just much more effective is to really audition candidates, um, and have them work with either one or two people to see how they would work in a collaborative environment on whatever the problem is. And it's not just a programming problem, but it could be a marketing issue, it could be a product issue, it could be anything really. Um, but what the team agreed on is that whatever issues we give to these people, they should be real things that we're trying to answer. We shouldn't
Right.
necessarily have the answers ourselves, and we're looking to them. How can they lead us? How can they be led? And all of those things. And what they found is that they were able to get really good candidates who the people who sort of they felt they would want to work with on a day to day turned out to be really good employees. And uh, it was just a matter of kind of managing this in a way and kind of paying some attention to it. Because one of the things with hiring is that people who need to hire the most tend to be the busiest, and it's hard to take their time. So there needed to be a
Right.
triage process up front where skilled people who weren't necessarily the hiring managers could actually assess candidates up front. So it was really just taking a big problem that this company had and compressing it into actionable pieces along the way, and with metrics in place to figure it out. So
Yeah. So even though it's, your background, like mine, is in engineering management, and so taking those same principles of working in small chunks and delivering value and applying that to the hiring process around the team. So not just how the team performs its work, but also how you bring people in to the team, how you integrate them in, how you interview for them,
right,
that sort of thing.
right.
I like it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's like solving a technical problem.
Sure.
In some ways, the company had to articulate, well, what's important to us? What are we really hiring for? Are we hiring for cultural fit? Are we hiring for this or that? And you know, that's kind of the discovery work that needed to happen. They needed to answer, well, who is an ideal candidate for us and what are their qualities and what should we be looking for. And if somebody is actually in a role who's not the hiring manager who needs to assess candidates, what should they be looking for and how do we agree on these things? And in
Right.
some ways it's sort of like figuring out, you know, what is the customer's real problem that they need to solve, and how are we going to go about doing that.
Yeah, I like how you talked about how you mentioned that when you're talking to people outside of the team, you're not using a lot of fancy agile terminology, even though you're trying to apply some of the same principles. And I think that's really important, and it makes me think too about when you're talking about applying agile principles or more broadly, let's just say lean management to things outside of software development. You definitely see it. This is an area where you notice differences between different agile methodologies, right? Scrum is very much geared around software development. The
Right.
terminology of it, the rituals, the different meetings are all really geared towards a software development team. I think in a lot of cases harder to apply to a non-software problem or team. Whereas Kanban is a very generic process that really comes from auto manufacturing,
Right.
right?
Right.
Comes from Toyota and lean manufacturing, and is less prescriptive in how you work and the way you structure things, and so applicable to a wider audience. Although even there, you could maybe overwhelm the HR group if you're trying to put in every Japanese Kanban term into the process. But if you just take those basic principles of
Right.
visibility
Yep.
and
And
measuring flow through the system, then
right.
boom, you're agile.
And in fact, they used a Kanban board for this,
Perfect.
and I think they used Trello. And
Uh,
the thing about it is that it really worked perfectly for them. It enabled everybody on the team to communicate through the cards and move them over and shuffle them around and do all of that without ever really uttering anything about Agile.
right.
They were doing Agile without really realizing that they were doing that. So it
Yeah,
was it's a
I love
beautiful
it.
thing.
Yeah, can you give us another example of applying agile outside of a software development team?
Well, do you want to talk about sales or just,
Sure.
okay?
Yeah, let's talk about sales.
So okay, so sales seems like one of these deals where, all right, so either you make the sale or you don't make the sale. What's agile
Right.
about that? And the other thing about sales is that sales has kind of a can have a terrifically long and unpredictable sales cycle,
Yeah.
depending on if you're doing enterprise sales or other kinds of sales. There, the relationships have to be cultivated, and other things need to kind of be put in place. But when you think about sales kind of at a more macro level, the thing about it is that sales um, is really consequential, and a sales forecast is probably the most consequential document a company can deliver, because it affects everything. It affects hiring, it affects bonuses, it affects kind of targets, it affects capital spending, it affects just about everything. And the way these things are often done is that a head of sales and a CFO may huddle together in Q4 or Q3 of the previous year and put together this forecast and deliver it. And then all kinds of decisions are made based on that about all those things I just mentioned. And the thing about it is that invariably that sales forecast is wrong. Um,
Right.
just how wrong it is, it's probably really wrong, because things happen. And it's one of these things that lends itself to an agile process in that continuing to revisit that sales forecast on a regular basis and updating it and modifying it and keeping in mind what the original goals were is really important. And the thing is, if something accelerates in a sales process, and your forecast was too conservative, that's a bad thing. If it's something that was regarded as a sure deal falls through, that can be a devastating thing. And by paying close, tight attention to these things, it really does allow a company to be more nimble in terms of how it does things. And so in terms of hiring, for example, if if things aren't going quite the way you expect them to do, you find out early on and you hold back on hiring, and you kind of manage to where you're at a given time. And just like a software project, as time moves forward in a sales process, there's more clarity about what's going to close and what's not going to close, and you can take actions, you know, appropriately based on that. So and it so that's sort of, I think, how sales can be agile in kind of a big way. I think
Yeah.
in a small way, I think sales groups are already doing this, where they kind of are tracking. I mean, sales is probably the best at metrics because they sort of can, they kind of have built-in hard metrics about the number of meetings they have, about the number of conversions from pilot to close they have, all those kinds of things that they do keep very good track of. And I think salespeople are often judged by how many of these meetings they have and how many calls they have and how many of this and that's they've done. So in that sense, I think that process is actually can be chunked into small things rather than just we have this pipeline, and we think these are sure things, and this is
Yeah.
what our number is going to look like at the
And
end of the
and
year.
that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about and kind of drill into a little bit more is how you break things down into smaller chunks, right? Into smaller bites. In software development, it seems easier to me in a way, right? We can just build part of this feature and call that fully done and release it to a customer and call it value. But maybe that's just my bias coming from a development background, right? It's a little bit harder for me to look at a sales process or an HR process and say how do you break that down into
Yeah.
smaller chunks. So how do you do that? Is it all about those kind of like leading indicator
Well,
metrics
I think
of
it's about. I
sales
mean,
calls
I
made?
think it's about metrics, and it's really just about kind of recognizing where in the process every opportunity is, and and kind of managing to that, and kind of understanding that this opportunity is this far away, and these are the things that actually need to happen before that's going to become real. We need to cultivate this relationship. We need to provide some sort of demonstration of something to them. We need to keep them warm, and we need to continue to kind of manage to that. And and so I mean, it seems like there are, in terms of the phases to get to this big thing that, if you think the sale is the thing, I think there really are ways to chunk up that whole process, and there really are well defined stages. um, just because most sales of any big size don't just happen. They happen over some span of time that
Right.
can be managed to.
Yeah.
I think really in some ways good sales teams are already kind of the could be the most agile in a company if they're sort of looking at things that way.
Right. Well, they're arguably judged the most harshly against the value that they deliver, right?
Yeah,
And the value they deliver is very quantifiable, you
yeah,
know?
yeah. But another thing about these big sales kind of forecasts is that a lot of bonus plans are based on sales numbers, and lots of companies say, well, your bonus is paid based on your own personal performance along with company performance, and we manage these two together, and all of that. But the problem is then employees are given objectives that are important at the time, and as managers, we know kind of sometimes at the end of the year when you're looking at objectives, they're no longer important to the company. It's sort of
Right.
like a waterfall process where you're designing something and you take so long to design it that by the time it's designed, it's obsolete. And that's what kind of happens to objectives that are treated that way, that are based on this is what we're going to sell and this is what who we're going to sell to, and therefore these are the most important things to our company. And
Yeah.
I think what it is it's an argument for revisiting objectives and revisiting bonus plans and revisiting these things on you know much more frequent than an annual basis too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could do a whole nother separate episode just about compensation in an agile context and what does that mean? And there's varying opinions on that. We'll have to be careful about going down that rabbit hole now, but there's a lot to consider there
Sure.
because you can, in any process where people are judged by any form of metric, they're going to gear their behavior to that a little bit. So I like what you say about, like in a sales context, yes, they're going to be judged on certain goals and their pay is going to be tied to that, but we do still need to keep in mind the bigger objective of what we're trying to do and who and how we're selling, because that's really important, just like in a software development project, right?
Yeah.
If I'm a product owner type or a requirements analyst in a more traditional or larger structure, and all I'm judged on is did I produce a pretty requirements document,
Right.
but that doesn't actually relate to value delivered to customers, then I'm not really being judged on what the company's objective is are we delivering value to our customers and improving customer loyalty and all these other things, not writing a pretty document, right? So yeah, we have to balance all those things against each other for sure. I think it's for me a key aspect of applying Agile to anything outside of software development is that we have to have this flexibility and leave space for changing and removing a lot of things from the process. Like I would say, estimation, at least, is depending on the process you're measuring, may or may not make sense, right? Scrum kind of requires it, Kanban doesn't. But if Agile is really nothing more than are we making our work visible, on a board of some kind, for example? Is it visible? Is it prioritized? And then we're just treating it like a very visible and highly prioritized to-do list. Well, we could do that with anything. We could do that with, our chores at home. We could do that with a sales process. We could do that with financial processes, right? All
Yeah.
sorts of things,
Yeah.
right?
You
That's
could
all it is.
you could have written this book, Aaron.
Well, it would have been too short if I said, here's all you need to do. I mean, I always joke when I teach classes on Agile, there's a day-long seminar that I still do through the University of Virginia. And I usually start off with this lesson about basically saying what I just said, like, make your work visible, make it highly prioritized, and then go through that list of prioritized work as fast as possible. And this is now, maybe 15 minutes into an 8-hour day. And I've said, if you can just remember those, you can tune out the rest of the day. The next 7.5 hours don't matter. If you go back to your work and you make it more visible and more prioritized, you're being pretty agile, right? That's probably an improvement over what you're doing right now.
Right. Yeah, indeed, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say, is there anything that you cannot make agile in a company?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is I'm not an agile zealot. I do a little. I denigrate waterfall in my book.
Uh-huh.
I have a section.
Well deserved.
I have a section where I think I titled it something like um, "Waterfall, oh waterfall, how do I hate thee? Let me count the ways."
Right.
But the thing is that sometimes there are things that one needs to do that aren't agile. So for example, suppose you're writing a website for supermarket e-commerce. You have a grocery store and you're building something from scratch that customers want to buy groceries. Uh, that's a big complicated piece of software that one is undertaking, and it's not just that you can say, well, hey, let's start with our shopping cart and let's just work on that and deliver some functionality. Somebody might need to envision, well, how's this website going to look? What are the components of it? How are they going to snap together in the end? What does this thing really look like? And that is one of these things where somebody could say, well, that's where waterfall is good, because you are taking a big look at things and kind of working through that. And my response is that it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Um, Agile has or waterfall has its merits in that things don't get dropped on the floor so much because you're taking a good hard look at a problem. On the other hand, you're probably taking too hard a look at the problem in that you're figuring out things
Right.
that don't need to be figured out. But in this supermarket example, one would need to figure out, well, what are the components of this thing? What are the big pieces of this? How are these things going to work together? And what's the framework that they're kind of all snapping into? And if you have multiple teams doing multiple pieces of this, how are they all going to work together, and what are the contracts between them, and how do you know if they finish at different times? How are we going to make that work? Um, so that's really kind of a discovery process, I think. So I don't really call it a waterfall process, but it's a process that's not bound by a 2 week sprint necessarily. It's a process that is sort of undertaken by experts, either people who kind of technically are experts or from a product perspective and understand what customers are really after, um, design experts, usually a combination of these people who kind of need to get to the edge of this problem and figure out, well, first, is it technically feasible for us to do this thing? And then what, what might it look like if we were to do something like this? Not
Right.
not designing it, not developing it, not executing any of that. It's and sticking to kind of, here's kind of the overview of what we think. And I think that's where it would differ from a waterfall project. But in that sense, what I'm saying is that not every piece of every project is necessarily agile. Uh, uh, I think that the principles of Agile, and this principle of starting with big and making small and delivering along the way, makes a lot of sense as long as it's in the context of the bigger picture of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're really highlighting there is the importance of vision and strategy, right?
Sure.
And Scrum and Kanban don't tell you anything about how to come up with a great vision for your product or how to come up with a great corporate strategy. They tell you how to optimize flow through a system and get, individual pieces of work and pieces of customer value out to the customers as fast as possible. And that's awesome. We love that. We want to do that, and we want to get better and better at that. But if we don't know what the customer needs or what we're building for them, then it's pointless to be efficient at doing the wrong thing, right?
Yeah,
So
sure.
no one wants to do that. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. I think it's, I wouldn't give too much credit to the term waterfall for that notion, but we need to still wrap our team processes within a sort of a corporate strategic purpose with a vision for this product, with user experience and user research on a regular basis, and those things can still be managed. Things like user research in particular, you can still do that in small chunks parallel to your sprints, as you go through the development of a product. And you should still do it in iterations rather than kind of, do it all up front and assume that that's exactly what customers would want a year later, right? But you still have to, you can iterate to nowhere if you don't have a good strategy or a vision in place. And so that is still really important to wrap all these things around with. I think that's a particular point of tension uh, when you are trying to apply Agile, not only to non-software processes, but also just anything in a larger corporate environment, right? Because now you've got to sync across multiple teams and keep them aligned with each other to that vision.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of one of the challenges in that is really not necessarily kind of the mission of the stories that a team would undertake. And a lot of people have asked me kind of on the managerial side, well, if agile teams are self-managing, I'm a manager, what do I do? Am I out of a job, and that kind of thing? And my response is, well, no, not at all. In fact, your role is actually even more pivotal in that you're not necessarily telling the team exactly how they're supposed to work, or what they get done, because they're agreeing on that. But you need to kind of lift your head up when they're working heads down and figure out, well, how do these things fit in, and how
Yeah.
do we communicate with other teams that are building things, and if things are finishing at different times that are dependent on one another. How do we manage that from an interface perspective? And
Yeah.
and it's not, I'm not just talking about engineering and software. I'm talking about other things, like if marketing, for example, is out of sync with what product is delivering,
Right.
how do you manage that, and how do you deal with those things?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of the managerial role in this is about that kind of coordination
Hmm.
and management of that. And my 10x consulting stuff was really about things like that that fall on the floor as teams sort of have their own missions and their own objectives.
Yeah.
It's when things have to kind of mesh between teams, it's a big challenge if nobody is really looking out for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's, that point of the importance of coordination and collaboration across teams, as well as that manager, that leader role, still providing a consistent vision across those teams is so incredibly important. Key part of rolling out Agile in an enterprise or in non-software development projects, super important. So I think that's a great point for us to end on, David. Really appreciate your time in this conversation today. How can our listeners get in touch with you for more information, and where can they buy a copy of your book,
Okay, well,
The Agile Enterprise?
probably the best way to get in touch with me is through LinkedIn. Just look me up. I'd be happy to chat, and I yeah, I welcome that. Um, the book is available on Amazon, so if you search for Ash Agile Enterprise, you'll find something. And so yeah, that's the easiest way to do it. I think it's available on in paper and Kindle. So
Perfect. And we'll be sure to include links to those in the show notes for this episode on
thank you.
scalingtechpod.com. So certainly encourage our listeners to go there and check out David's book, and get the notes from this and all other episodes that we have. And make sure to give us a like and a follow on whatever platform you're following this episode of the Scaling Tech Podcast. Thank you so much, David, for joining me today. Really
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Aaron. Really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.